today's speaker. I'm going to introduce him, but having the opportunity to be an introducer at a lecture where Professor Mnookin is speaking, I have to tell you how honored we are to have him here. Superstar, I think, is an overused word in sports, but Professor Mnookin is truly one in the world of legal education. Let me talk a little bit about Professor Sharp on our faculty here. He's the John Deaver Drinko Baker and Hostetler Professor. He has his undergraduate degree from Clark, his JD from Northwestern. After a federal clerkship, he practiced for a year in Chicago, then spent 4 years as a trial attorney with the National Labor Relations Board. He began his teaching career at Virginia, and he came to Case Western in 1984. He's taught evidence, trial tactics, alternative dispute resolution, as well as courses in labor and employment law, and he's written in all of these areas. So again, Professor Sharp will speak to you now and introduce Professor Mnookin. Thank you.
Dean Simpson. Once again, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the CISCDR Distinguished Scholar in Residence Lecture. I'm also happy to have this opportunity publicly to welcome to the law school our new dean, Jerry Simpson, an eminent scholar and teacher who comes to us from Cornell Law School. We believe that the law school will thrive under his leadership, and we're delighted that he has joined us. Today's CISCDR Distinguished Scholar in Residence Lecturer, I describe as a model proponent of the unity of theory and practice in his distinguished body of work in the field of conflict resolution. He's a leading scholar in the field of conflict resolution, applying an interdisciplinary approach to negotiation and conflict resolution to a broad range of public and private problems. He has written 9 books and numerous scholarly articles, very important ones, including 2 that have won the book prize from the CPR Institute of Dispute Resolution, and the 3rd winning the 1993 William J. Good Book Award for the most outstanding book-length contribution of the year to family scholarship. He's also practiced as a neutral in high-level disputes, and this is where the practice part of that unity comes in. For example, he shaped an innovative resolution of the landmark dispute over operating system software between IBM and Fujitsu. He's also arbitrated international commercial disputes involving other advanced technologies and served on an appellate panel in a salary cap dispute involving the National Basketball Association and the National Basketball Players Association. He's a mediator who has successfully mediated many complex commercial disputes including an environmental dispute between the Motorola and Siemens corporations, a multi-party dispute involving 10 international banks, an indenture trustee, and a large accounting firm, contractual disputes concerning the supply of power and co-ownership of generating facilities between large public utilities, and many major asbestos-related insurance coverage disputes. He started his teaching career at Bow Hall, University of California, Berkeley, in 1972 after graduating from Harvard College of Economics in 1964, receiving his law degree from Harvard in 1968, and clerking for Supreme Court Justice John M. Harlan. Before going to Harvard, he was on the Stanford faculty from 1981 to 1993, where he was the Delbert H. Sweet Professor of Law and Director of the Stanford Center on Conflict and Negotiation, and interdisciplinary group concerned with overcoming barriers to the negotiated resolution of conflict. He's also been a visiting fellow at Williston College, Oxford University, a visiting professor of law at Columbia Law School, and a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. I think he's currently doing that as well. So to deliver the sister scholar-in-residence lecture entitled Negotiating Ethnic Conflict, please join me in welcoming the Samuel Williston Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, the chair of the Steering Committee on the Program on Negotiation at Harvard, and the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project, Professor Robert H. Mnookin.
What a pleasure to be here. My talk today is about negotiating ethnic conflict. And what I intend to do is something that you have every right to think of as a little bizarre. I'm going to compare the ethnic conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, those are the flags on the left, to the ethnic conflict within Belgium, between the Flemish and the Walloons. Now, you all read every week about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And how many in the room know that there is an ethnic conflict between the Flemish and the Walloons? Actually, more than in many places. I want to say, first, at the start, what I'd like to do is answer the question, is there an ethnic conflict in Belgium and what's it all about? And by way of introduction, I'd like to explain how I got interested in comparing these two, which I fear often manages to offend people on all sides of both these conflicts, that they're even compared. But I think there are things to be learned from comparing. Let me begin with a few words about Belgium. How many in the room have ever been to Belgium? Actually, that's a lot. We've got a lot of cosmopolitan people. You know, Belgium is a great country. I think it has the best food in Europe. It's 2/3 the price of French food. Honestly, every bit is good. But it's not kind of on the American grand tour norm. And many Americans know next to nothing about Belgium. The striking feature for anyone who's ever visited Belgium is a language frontier, which is drawn on this map. In the south, the Walloons speak French. In the north, the Flemish speak Dutch. And Brussels, you can see, is in Flanders, but it has hash lines because it is officially bilingual. Now this, about 60% of the population are Dutch speaking, about 40% are Flemish speaking. And in fact, this linguistic frontier has essentially existed for about 15 centuries. 15 centuries, a long time. It goes back into kind of late Roman periods. I was invited this past spring. I had something called the Frankie International Chair. And I was invited to Belgium by this Belgian foundation. And I had no intention of studying the conflict between the Belgians and the Walloons. I was, in fact, my host university was the Catholic University of Leuven, L-E-U-V-E-N. It was founded in 1425. It's more than 2 centuries older than Harvard. It's the oldest Catholic university in Europe, and it's Belgium's largest university. And during the 19th and early 20th century, its curriculum, although it was in the Flemish region, was taught entirely in French. Well, that was to change in the late 60s, and I knew this history because it was kind of interesting. In 1968, as part of Les Événements de 68, you know, there were troubles all over the world, in France, the United States, students made trouble everywhere. Well, the Flemish students in Leuven started mass protests objecting to any courses being taught at Leuven in French. By that time, the curriculum had courses both in French and in Dutch. The Flemish students said they wanted none of it. Well, as a result of these mass demonstrations, the university was split into two parts. And new universities formed in a new town. New town was created. Leuven, the old university, beautiful university town. You can see some of the pictures here. Charming town. I recommend it to you for a visit. Is about maybe 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers from Brussels. Well, 30 kilometers from Brussels in the Walloon direction, they built a new town called Leuven-la-Neuve. And it's Université Catholique de Leuven. It has exactly the same name, but in French. And it's a Catholic university now in the Walloon region. Now, a big problem, as you can imagine, is Leuven had a library. And, in terms of this divorce, how are you going to split the library? Well, the Belgians are good negotiators. The way they split the library was all books with even call numbers. All books with odd call numbers went to Leuven. And my hunch, because I teach negotiation, is afterwards they probably were trades back and forth to optimize, but it was kind of an interesting, one might say, Solomonic solution. Now, I was aware of this history when I went. And I was being hosted by the Dutch-speaking university, but I was asked to give lectures all over Belgium. And I didn't particularly teach courses just at Leuven. They were just my host. And while I was there, two things happened that really made me interested in this project that I want to describe to you. The first thing that happened, which stunned me, was there was issued right before I came, and at the time I came, it existed only the Dutch version existed. A manifesto was issued for an independent Flanders within Europe. In other words, a manifesto was issued for the Flemish to secede from Belgium, to break the country up, right? And I was kind of stunned. Why not? Because there might not be some crazy radicals. There's a right-wing party called Vlaams Belang that had been pressing for Flemish independence. But this manifesto was signed. It was over a 250-page report, which was issued by a group that met in the Waranda. The Waranda is the fancy men's club, the Flemish men's club. There's, of course, a separate French men's club. The Flemish men's club in Brussels, where the Flemish captains of industry and some academics all meet. Anyway, a group had been studying there their internal problems for several years. And this manifesto was signed by 60 leading captains of industry and academics. And indeed, the report, when I read the report read like a McKinsey & Company report. And not too surprising. Why? Well, because one of the active participants in this group was the chair of McKinsey & Company for the Benelux, who was also president of the Harvard Club of Belgium. Now, I say that just to say, these weren't student radicals. These weren't crazy. These were kind of people who were part of what might be called the center-right Flemish business establishment. Well, that sort of stunned me. And there was actually a great hullabaloo broke out after this manifesto was issued. This McKinsey chair ended up having, he's still a partner at McKinsey, but he had resigned chairmanship of the Benelux because a Walloon business objected vehemently and said, you have 5 days to get all your people out of here unless something's happened. I mean, it was crazy. It created a bit of a storm. Well, what was the argument that was made here for Flemish independence? Well, the argument was made was that Flanders and the Walloon region are deeply dissimilar. And they had grown apart. They were going to continue to grow apart. And that the federal structure, I'm going to say a little more about this in a few minutes. The last 30 years, Belgium evolved from a unitary central state, from the French model, to a federal system. And that the federal structure wasn't working, and it was unduly burdensome. And they also especially objected to transfers. As it turns out, the Flemish region today is much richer than the Walloon region. And in fact, I saw a television show while I was in Belgium, and it showed a moving van coming up to a house in the Flemish region. And out of the house, they moved furniture, they moved refrigerators, they moved all this stuff. And the message was, each year, the transfers amount to nearly 5,000 euros a year from each household in Flanders to each house in the Walloon region. Well, these business types didn't want that at all. And most of all, I think what they were concerned about, and they were deeply concerned, is that the Walloon region, which has a strong socialist and secular tradition, had what made it impossible to change the Social Security rules, the unemployment rules, and various other rules which they feared would make Belgium non-competitive in the long run. In the world of globalization, which Thomas Friedman's words would reflect. So anyway, that was their argument. They said independence is the only lasting solution. Well, that intrigued me. Here I was in Belgium. I was in Belgium because I wanted to study how the EU engaged in multilateral negotiations. I'm a student of ethnic conflict, or at least I have been in the last 4 or 5 years. This sounded really too interesting to pass on. Well, the second thing that happened was I was continuing my work at this time relating to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, about which I will say more. But in late February, early March, I went to the region. And as part of this trip, I was spending a lot of time interviewing Palestinians. This was after the election, after Hamas had been elected. And two different Palestinian intellectuals I interviewed. When they heard I was in Belgium for the semester, their eyes lit up. Each of them said, well, that's really my dream. I said, say more. And they said, you know, we of course will go along with the two-state solution. But each of them said, what I personally would like is a single secular state for Israel and what are now the occupied Palestinian territories, along the Belgian model. Well, I sort of politely suggested maybe they'd better look at Switzerland too, and moved on. But what intrigued me, of course, was the question of, well, what are the limits, really, of the capacity of federal regimes in societies with deep cleavages to accommodate ethnic differences. And now, before you dismiss this notion, it's interesting to look at Belgium, the internal conflict between the Flemish and the Walloons, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the same time. Let me show you some pretty stunning things, which I only put together in preparation of this lecture. There are some similarities. First, they are both ethnic conflicts with a territorial cleavage. Right? This map shows the linguistic line. It also shows the West Bank and Gaza. More striking, though, and both, by the way, pose the question, should there be two states or one? And there are people, both places, that want one, and some who want two. Secondly, look in terms of size. I found it incredible. They're almost exactly the same size. More fundamentally, look at the populations. It's almost the same population. And finally, the two-state solution in either place poses an anguishing problem of what happens to Brussels, which is presently the capital of Belgium and also the capital of the Flemish region, although its population is 85% Francophone. And what happens to Jerusalem? Because both Israelis and Palestinians want Jerusalem to be the capital of their state in terms of a two-state solution. So I thought these were kind of interesting comparisons. Now, of course, what's stunning about it, apart from the fact that no one knows much about the conflict between the Flemish and the Walloons, is it poses this very interesting question, which I have to say at the outset. From looking at a couple of cases, you're never going to give a complete answer, but it's at least suggested. And it really poses a very interesting question. Why are some ethnic conflicts violent, some ethnic conflicts violent, and others not? And why can some be resolved through negotiations, while others seem intractable? And what I want to begin with is to look briefly at the internal conflict within Belgium, where I want to suggest to you it's a very serious conflict. I think there's at least, a 35% chance that in the next 10 or 15 years, Belgium is going to go the way of Czechoslovakia and split up. All right? So you shouldn't presume that it's going to stay together. But what I'm quite confident of, it's not going to be violent. If it does split, it'll be contested, but it's not going to be violent. Well, let me tell you a little more about Belgium. Belgium is a very interesting country. I want to explain to you sort of what's underneath this conflict. In something I'm writing, I use as a metaphor the notion that a Flemish man from a peasant family married above himself in 1830 to a Francophone woman from the Walloon region. And she was kind of minor aristocracy. Now, this is only a metaphor. But in fact, Belgium is a new country. It's younger than the United States. It was created in 1830. For centuries, Belgium was dominated by the Habsburgs. Then, as a result of the Napoleon, the French Revolution was dominated by the French. And then briefly, from 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo until 1830, it was part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. But there's no Belgian independence. There's no Belgium. And indeed, what it was a bunch of separate provinces that for several centuries had been part of an amalgam ruled by some external power. Well, in 1830, Belgium was created essentially by the great powers that wanted a buffer between France, Germany, England. France, Germany, and England were contesting. The Russians were also involved, and this new country was created. The Belgian Revolution was a very curious result. It was rather bloodless, very few casualties, very little fighting, and the Dutch were kind of kicked out. But it was a very unusual coalition of liberal bourgeois elites who got together with the Catholic Church, and what they shared was resentment of Dutch control. That's about all. And the liberals resented Dutch control because it was external control. The Catholic Church resented Dutch control because it was too Protestant. Belgium is overwhelmingly Catholic. Well, during the first century of this arranged marriage, there was Francophone dominance, although the French speakers were in a minority. In fact, the Walloon region was much, much richer. Belgium, in fact, in the late 19th century, after England, was really the first part of Europe to industrialize. It had coal and steel. It became very rich. French was the language used in courts. French was language used for all official business. And the Flemish elite learned French, and if you were Flemish and you wanted to rise in the world, you had to learn French. around the turn of the century, as suffrage expanded, the Flemish resented their inability to officially use their own language. Indeed, there have been some real scandals relating to the operation of the legal system. There had been, for example, a very notorious case in the 1860s where two Flemish men were hung, convicted of murder, where it was clear that not only was the entire trial conducted in French, they didn't understand anything, but the judge only spoke French, and their lawyers only spoke French. And it was clear that they didn't understand at all what was going on. And there was a lot of evidence that came out later suggesting that they might be innocent. Well, gradually, I won't go into the details, but the Flemish movement evolved, where they were pressing for language rights and various cultural rights. And in fact, one of the most interesting things that happened only has occurred really since World War II. And that is a complete reversal of economic roles. It's as if the Weiss family, that were kind of minor aristocracy, has become quite a poor region, while the Flemish have prospered. And indeed, the regional per capita GDP in Flanders is higher than in Germany, and the Walloon is 40% higher than that of the Walloon region, the real economic disparities. And moreover, the Flemish are a majority. But they still carry with them this historical emblem of over a century of discrimination. When they go to Brussels still, although Brussels is supposed to be bilingual, very few Francophone people know Dutch. Many more Flemish know French. The Flemish are often tribal people who know English as well. And there's one resentment. Well, in all of this, as a result of Flemish pressure, and also a consequence of the changing economic roles, Belgium was transformed from a unitary national state to a federal state. Now, it's a federal state of mind-boggling complexity. There are 3 regions. There are 3 communities, 3 language communities. There are various powers delegated. The regions, the Flemish have consolidated both the Dutch language community, which is in charge of education and cultural affairs, with their region, which is in charge of all things related to land. But the Walloons have not. There's also a Brussels capital region, and as I indicated, Brussels is formally bilingual. Well, there are separate parliaments, and in fact, I'm not going to bore you with it, but it's a very interesting and enormously complicated institutional structure where there are all kinds of provisions to make sure that neither the Flemish nor the Walloons can make policy decisions at the national level unless both agree. You have to have a majority of both for various things. You have to have 2/3 majority for a lot of things. There are what are called alarm bell procedures. So you have to have concurrent majorities. In the national legislature now, every legislator has to be assigned to one language group or the other, and you only run for office within your language. Okay? Well, almost a century ago, a Belgian king was told that you reign over 2 peoples. In Belgium, there are Walloons and there are Flemish. There are no Belgians. I think this is a bit of an overstatement, but I think it's fair to say that the Belgian identity, the national identity, is quite thin. And in fact, I think that today, if you looked at Belgium, it's charitably sometimes described as 2 peoples living separately together. There is enormous residential and workplace segregation in the 2 regions. Brussels is the only place where they in fact work together. There's very little social interaction. I'll give you an example. I gave a presentation to the law faculty at Leuven. About 40 people, very cosmopolitan group, travel all over the world. All of them are, of course, fluent in English. Most of them know French as well. I said to them, How many of you count among your 20 best friends people from the Francophone community? 3 people. And these are people who have friends all over the world. Okay? Media, separate newspapers, no common ownership. Dutch-speaking papers there are. I mean, Flemish papers in Dutch. There are Walloon papers in French. There's separate politics. National political parties. There are no more national political parties. The Socialist Party split. The Christian Democratic Party split. The Liberal Party split. There are a couple specialized parties on each side. And, I think a serious question is, will the present federal structure hold? Now, there are a bunch of different alternatives that are conceivable. One, but this first one is only conceivable. It's never going to happen. And that is, there could be the kind of reconciliation where the national government was strengthened, where they took back more control at the national level, where they worked harder to sort of create a national identity. I believe in something the economists call path dependency. And although in 1970, when this federal evolution began, no one would have wanted to be where they ended up. You can't go backwards. You can't retrace the steps, because in fact, various political groups and other groups now have a stake in the current regime. So I think strengthening the national government is unlikely. The status quo is possible, but I think the status quo is unlikely because it's quite unmanageable. It's very difficult to make policy at the national level. In the European Commission, for example, because the Flemish and Walloon regions often can't agree, Belgium abstains in various decisions at the EU level. I mean, I give that as an example. Now, one possibility, which I think is rather likely, is that there's going to be a further devolution towards something that you might really call a confederal system, where Belgium exists literally almost in name alone. And they move towards a confederation. And I think the other possibility, of course, is there could be Flemish secession. Now, I think that the point, though, what I want to argue, is in the history of this conflict, since 1950, there have been a few mass demonstrations, not very many. There have been 3 or 4 people who have died, basically in labor protests that you might think were somehow related to the ethnic conflict, but not very much. And I'm quite confident that whatever happens, whether the center holds or not, it'll be negotiated out. They're going to work it out. And it's going to be a lot of hard bargaining. They've got to worry about if there was a divorce, what do you do about the national debt. There are a lot of hard issues. But I don't think there's going to be any violence. What do I think, pro or con, about whether it's going to stick together or not? The con, the reason I'm skeptical, and I've actually changed my mind as I keep studying this, when I ask myself the question, what's the glue holding this country together? If you ask that question, what's the glue? There's hardly any. There's a royal family, but I mean, no one gives much of a damn about the royal family until the king dies. Everybody weeps, but that doesn't exactly play a very important role. There's sports. Well, the Belgians have a couple pretty good tennis players. One's Flemish, by the way. If I think about why it might hold together, it's really because it's like a divorce situation where there's concern about Brussels. What would happen to Brussels? And I think in the metaphor, I say that at times now the husband says to the wife, I don't like your spending habits. And, you and your family, you're leeches, you're just living on me. And the husband says, at times I think about divorce. And the wife says, divorce? Impossible. Marriage is always permanent. Our bonds are indissoluble. And the husband says, look at Czechoslovakia, right? They don't have to be indissoluble. And the wife says, if we divorce, remember, I keep the child. Brussels is the child. Brussels is 85% Francophone. The Flemish have very complicated attitudes towards Brussels. A lot of Flemish people don't like Brussels. They feel like it's a foreign city, but they take pride in it. It's the capital of Europe. Right? And the husband says to the wife, don't be so sure. You know, the kid is like a 17-year-old in a divorce. The kid's going to have a say for himself, and Brussels knows where the money is, and Brussels, like you, is a big spender. So don't be so sure, you know, if there's some kind of plebiscite, Brussels wouldn't come with us. Anyway, so so in this, there's no divorce bargaining yet, but in kind of the preliminaries, this is the implicit game of chicken that's going on. And of course, the wife says, you also got to remember, what are the neighbors going to think? You know, they're a little worried about the EU. There's a divorce. Could Brussels still be the capital of Europe? You know, but and I can't say if it. The reason there may not be a divorce is there's something of a tradition of compromise. Belgium is rather prosperous, and there's a little fear and uncertainty if there were split up, what might be the economic consequences and how would it affect investment. The Flemish think it's potential, the Flemish think it would help. But most fundamentally, and this is something I'm not going to be able to talk about today, but I study, is there's a political elite at the national level who are used to doing business. And these are the heads of the parties. And Belgium is sometimes called a partocracy, because the parties are extremely powerful. And there's very little direct control. There are proportional representations that they can be voted. And these folks, I think, actually, in sort of this ongoing game of chicken, part of why I think the Flemish are disadvantaged in the negotiations a little bit is because I think the Walloon political elite, when they look at each other in the eye, and the Flemish say, we've got to regionalize Social Security and unemployment policies. As a national policy, it's horrific. We don't like what you're doing. The Walloon leaders say they're running with this. Impossible. National solidarity. Won't happen. And the Flemish said, you know, I got people back here who want a divorce. You're playing with fire. Well, I think part of the problem in terms of negotiations here, in terms of this game of chicken, first of all, there are lots of ways to compromise. And I think we'll find it. In terms of the game of chicken, I think the Walloons, though, the Walloon political figure, looking at the Flemish guy, knows this guy doesn't really want a divorce. The political leader doesn't want a divorce. He's a principal agent problem. He likes being a national political leader. And maybe he wouldn't have quite the same role. But this national political lead has played a very interesting and constructive role. Now, let's turn to in some ways, much more difficult and sadder conflict. And that is the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I've written a fair amount about this, and I'll be glad to give the citations to Professor Sharp, and for those who want to explore in more detail the very abbreviated argument. But basically, I've been studying this conflict for 3 or 4 years. And I began this work, this relates to negotiation, by seeing what I saw as a very profound paradox. And the paradox is that there is a conspicuous two-state deal that would probably make a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians better off. But the parties can't do it. And I've asked myself, the question I asked myself, why is this? First of all, what's the two-state deal? The two-state deal was reflected in President Clinton's proposal as the Camp David talks were collapsing. It involves a number of elements. A secure Israel that remains a democratic Jewish state. There'll be a new Palestinian state formed. Jerusalem would become a condominium of sorts, and that is to be parts of Jerusalem. The Palestinian parts would be Palestinian, the Jewish parts of Jerusalem would be Jewish. Other parts, like a condominium, there would be common areas that would be ruled jointly. What this result would require, though, is the evacuation of Jewish settlements. I'm going to say more about that. And it would also require that the Palestinian refugees give up the claim of the right to return in some definitive way. Now, my thesis is that the reason that the primary barriers in terms of understanding this conflict and why it has been so intractable is because there are behind-the-table conflicts within each community that make it next to impossible for a political leader to make and sell the deal. That's the sad reality. And I think what are the internal conflicts? Well, the internal conflicts among Israeli Jews, I think, concerns the future of the Jewish settlements. This is a map. Each of those triangles, when I first saw this map, I looked at the wheat. I spent a lot of time now in the region. Each of those triangles represents a Jewish settlement in this. There are presently 250,000, leaving aside Jerusalem, and the annexed portion of Jerusalem, there are 250,000 Jewish settlers in this. In settlements that are spread all over. Now, the settlers are not all of one kind. There really are three kinds of settlers. There are a lot of settlers, probably half of the 250,000, who moved to the West Bank because the housing was cheap. And it's not because of any ideological commitment to Eretz Israel, a broader concept of Israel. A quarter of the settlers are what Israelis call the Haredim. The Haredim are ultra-Orthodox. They're the folks that look like they stepped out of Warsaw around 1805. Black hats. Probably some in Boston. There are probably some ultra-Orthodox here in Cleveland. There certainly are in parts of New York. They like living together in very close communities. And the reason a quarter of the settlers are Haredim, the reason they moved there, is for the most part they're quite poor. Many of the men are studying the Talmud. They don't serve in the Israeli military. Historically, they didn't really participate in Israel's political life, but were kind of independent. That's not quite so true. But I like to say, and this is a slight overstatement, but not a complete overstatement, that the reason they moved to the West Bank is there was cheap housing, they could live together. And if their Rebbe told them, well, next year we're going to go to Topeka, Kansas, they go there. Because a lot of them hardly recognize the existence of the state. The driving force behind the settlement movement is the remaining 25%. And they're what I call national religious settlers. For them, the settlement project is a fusion of religious zeal and nationalism. These people very much participate in the army, and they really took the unexpected outcome of the '67 war, when Israel found itself suddenly in the West Bank, all of Jerusalem. These national religious settlers literally took that as a sign from God that it was time for the Jews to reoccupy all of the biblical Israel. And that's been their project ever since the 70s. And what's amazing is there are a quarter of 250,000 people. Basically, 62,000 people. The Jewish population of Israel is about 5 million. They're 1%, a little over 1% of the Jewish population of Israel. And yet, they have driven this project. And they've had enormous influence and success. They, of course, protested the evacuation of Gaza, and blessedly that was peaceful. But they are a considerable force. Now, why is relocation? For the deal to happen, settlers have to be relocated. Now, it may be that you don't have to resettle all 250,000. If there were a land swap, and I think this is quite possible, it would certainly make things easier, where portions of land across the Green Line closest to Israel were annexed to Israel. In exchange, Israel gave other land that's now part of Israel proper and other consideration. You'd only have to evacuate 100,000. But the point is, evacuating 100,000 people, we saw there were problems evacuating 9,000 from Gaza. Well, this is 100,000. And some people estimate it cost $1 billion to evacuate the Gaza. There are also security issues. I was a big fan of what Prime Minister Sharon did in Gaza. It was unilateral. Too bad it wasn't negotiated. But on the other hand, getting the settlers out of Gaza I thought was a good thing. And yet, as a result of what's happened since, both in Lebanon and in Gaza, the notion of trading, of giving land up unilaterally, where Israelis perceive a risk of getting shelled from the land they've just given up control of, is not an appealing. So there are many reasons I think this Lebanese business was a catastrophe. But a part of it is because of, I think, its impact on the internal politics within Israel. One question that's been very interesting to me is why has this small group of national religious settlers had such disproportionate power? Well, it's something I've written about at length, and I've listed some of the elements here. But the point that most of all I'd like to emphasize is this last one. Because I think you can only understand the internal stuff and focus on this. While they're a very small minority, and while most Israelis don't really approve of the project, they can appeal to themes that have much broader resonance within Israeli society. What are some of these themes? I've listed a bunch of these things. Israel, after all, was created by settlements, by settling land, by people who thought of themselves as pioneers. Well, today Israel is a modern, industrial, first world state. But this pioneer spirit, who in Israel is still representing the pioneer spirit? The settlers claim that mantle. The settlers, by the way, and a lot of Palestinians say what we're doing is a natural continuation of Zionism. Zionism, by the way, is a word that's so contested it can have any meaning you want to attach to it. But they do. They also claim themselves as successors of the kibbutz movement. Historically, Israel ideology, labor ideology, was very socialist, very communitarian. Well, today in Tel Aviv, I'll tell you, it's not communitarian. And yet, if you visit these settlements, as I've had, these are places where neighbors know each other, neighbors defend each other, the old communitarian spirit's there. And that has broader resonance, and they're willing to point that out to others. They also, Israel's always had this concept of a serving elite. You know, who are the bravest of the various army units? Today, many of the soldiers in the elite units are disproportionately children of settlers. And finally, there's of course the religious roots. Israel, a majority of Israelis are secular. They're not very religious. But on the other hand, the Bible is taught in secular schools in Israel as part of the country's history. And the notion, and the truth is, the settlers are right in that biblical Israel was not along the coast. It wasn't where Tel Aviv is. It was in the center. And a lot of it was, in the West Bank region. And a lot of Israelis who really don't much like the settlement project, the notion of having as part of their country these biblical sites is appealing to them. Well, in all of this, enough about the internal conflict within Israel. But what I want to suggest to you, it's a very profound conflict. And the reason, I mean, in my view, is outrageous, but the reason during the whole camp of the Oslo period, from 93 to 2000, the number of settlers in the West Bank went from 100,000 to 200,000 during the Oslo process. It's been against the United States policy for settlements to expand. They've never been stopped. They haven't been stopped when the Labour government was in power. They haven't been stopped by what the Hood was actually behind the settlements. You see? And to understand why, it's because there was really, on the part of Labour, there was a fair amount of complicity, but a lot of it was just avoidance and deferral. They knew this was going to be an unbelievably contentious and difficult issue. And the view was, well, until we really have a deal in hand, what can we do about it? And there was never a deal in hand. Anyway, a few words about the Palestinians and the internal conflict among Palestinians. I really don't have to say too much to make the point that there are profound internal conflicts among the Palestinians. I mean, today, look what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, there's something that is, they're teetering on the edge of violent internal conflict between elements in Fatah and Hamas. But the conflict that I've sort of focused on is quite interesting. Is a conflict where, on the surface, there is no conflict. And that is the conflict among Palestinians over the scope and meaning of the right of return. Now, what this relates to is the claim that Palestinians make that the refugees who left what is now Israel and their descendants have both an individual and a collective right to return. And that is part of the demand for any peace deal. By the way, this prisoners' initiative, about which there was going to be a referendum, it hasn't quite happened yet, although I think in many ways parts of that are quite promising. It includes a broad definition of the right of return. Now, what's interesting about the right of return is when you talk to Palestinians, sophisticated Palestinians, the cosmopolitans, say, we know it can't be part of the deal. I mean, the one thing that's clear, Israel never agreed. There are great disagreements with Israel, but about one thing is completely agreed. And that is, they're not going to make a peace deal in which hundreds of thousands or millions of Palestinians get to return to Israel. They want to be a Jewish state. And as one Palestinian intellectual said, if there's a broad right of return, there's not one Palestinian state, there are two Palestinians. So it's an absolute non-starter. Sophisticated Palestinians all know that. And you ask, why do you keep talking about the right of return? They say, well, it's a bargain. It's a little bit, by the way, about the way some Israelis talk about the settlements. We know they're going to have to go. Everybody knows they're going to have to go. Why don't you get rid of them now? They're going to be a bargaining chip. Besides, it's hard. Right? So there's that kind of interesting parallel. Well, in all events, the numbers are pretty staggering. There are probably 4 million Palestinian refugees, Palestinian diaspora, refugees and their descendants, the countless. Well, let me conclude by simply saying that there are very interesting parallels in terms of the Israeli and Palestinian communities. First of all, both peoples have narratives of suffering and victimization. Secondly, the internal conflicts in both Israel and among Palestinians involve profound issues of identity. There are settlers who have defined their whole life's project in terms of the settlement. They're doing God's work, settling Eretz Israel. There are Palestinians who could live more comfortably outside of refugee camps and who won't leave a refugee camp, and who oppose sometimes policies by which the quality of their lives might be improved in a day-to-day sense if they left the camps. Because why? That would be somehow acquiescing and giving up what they see as their status as refugees and their right of return. Both groups, the settlers and the refugees, make appeals that have much broader resonance among their population. There's this bargaining chip mentality, even among those who are willing to make trades. And indeed, the thing wrong with bargaining chip mentality is every time rhetorically it's made difficult when you're playing with people's lives. There are true believers on both sides in terms of refugees who really think they should have an individual right to decide whether they go back or not. Maybe I'll decide not to go back, but I've got to have part of any peace deal. I've got to have the right to decide whether to go back to there's all the fabled keys hanging by the door, the keys to the old house. And there are some such true. Massive needs for compensation, if there's going to be a relocation. And finally, there's a big comparison because money's not going to be enough. One settler said to me, if someone offered me $2 million to leave my house, I'd spit on it. So I buried my father here. My children live here. This has been my life's project. He said, if I thought it was for the good of the nation, I might do it voluntarily. But the idea that money's going to be enough The same way you start talking about compensation with many Palestinian refugee groups, and they say, you're trying to bribe us. You're trying to have us give up our dream, our identity. All right, well, both pose monumental leadership challenges. All right? And finally, let's contrast the two conflicts. Both involve a history of discrimination. But one involves not only a history of discrimination, but a history of discrimination and occupation where there has been a century of violence. The other, there hasn't been. Geography. Big differences geographically. And in a way, it was a little bit of a trick. I showed you that there's this language cleavage. Other than Brussels, very few Francophones live in Flanders, and hardly any Flemish live in the Walloon region. In other words, you could divide pretty cleanly the country. Well, how about Israel and the Palestinian territories? As we've seen, you've got 250,000 Jewish settlers in the Palestinian territories. Moreover, 20% of the Israeli population, people who are Israeli citizens, are Arabs. So there's a lot of intermingling. There's no clean way to kind of disengage geographically. Economics. What's very interesting is the average GDP of Israelis is about $24,000 a year. And the average GDP in Belgium of the Flemish region is about $31,000 a year, and it's only about $23,000 a year in the Walloon region. So there's still disparity. Okay? However, among Israelis and Palestinians in the territory, it's over 20 to 1. The average GDP in the Palestinian territories is about $1,000 per person. Okay? As compared to Israel, which is nearly in the mid-20s. Israel is a modern industrial country. So there are huge economic disparities. Moreover, Belgium's pretty prosperous. The Palestinian territories are very impoverished. Internal political context and institutions, the role of elites, different. I think in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, there are really spoilers on both sides. Actually, in the Flemish dispute with the Walloons, the Walloons bloc, there's a right-wing party that in some sense spoilers too. But the power of spoilers is very differential. Finally, there's the international political context of institutions. The French and the Dutch don't give a damn. Whether it's one country, two countries, it's not as if the French are saying to the Walloon region, secede, so you can be part of us, right? And they're not egging in, the Dutch aren't egging on the Flemish, right? Well, contrast that with the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Israel gets hundreds of millions of dollars of support from the Jewish diaspora. The Arab countries, in fact, often are benefiting from the internal conflicts between the Israelis and the Palestinians because they can take the focus off of some of their own internal problems. So the international context is very different. Indeed, I think another point is that the stakes are much less. I mean, as one person said to me when I talked to them about this, whether Belgium's one state or two, how much turns on it? If they're both within Europe, you have supranational authority, which has more and more. There's going to be a common market for the whole region anyway. You're going to have a single currency. There's kind of less at stake. There are identity issues in terms of the Flemish. I don't want to minimize that. But if you think about the ideological and religious stakes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's of a different dimension. And it's much harder. I wish I could be optimistic about there being a negotiated resolution of Israeli-Palestinian, but I'm not optimistic about it happening anytime soon. I fervently hope that I've been working towards it happening someday. But what I want to leave you with is the message that with respect to that conflict, I think understanding its full complexity and understanding the internal conflicts that lie underneath it are profoundly important because it can avoid what I think is the monumental risk of the international community of the United States exaggerating our capacity to create peace. If Iraq has taught us anything, it should be that our capacity to internally intervene in these complicated situations and structure things, maybe using a federal system, whatever. There ought to be a fair degree of modesty. And all of the Europeans, by the way, I just spent 4 months in Europe. The Europeans think the deal is obvious. And you ask Europeans, why do you think it's not happening? What's the United States for? Why is that? Well, the United States would just get tough with Israel. We can impose it. And why don't you impose it? You don't impose it because the Jewish lobby is so powerful. They don't sometimes say that out loud, but in the press, it's what they believe. Now, I'm one who thinks AIPAC is pretty potent, particularly because of Congress. But I think there are other reasons the Bush administration is taking the policies that it has. But the most fundamental modesty that I think is required is how many American soldiers want to be shot at by settlers who don't want to be moved, or by Hamas or Islamic Jihad who are unhappy to use the destruction of the people. I mean, peacekeeping is a very complicated, difficult process. And my own view is, if there's going to be peace in the Middle East, ultimately, the Israelis, the Palestinians are going to have to do it. And there's lots that can be done to help them, to support them. There can be economic assistance and all kinds of things. But what I'd like to caution in this, and I think if you understand the internal dimensions of the conflict, you can see this better, is I think there ought to be a fair degree of humility. Thank you very much. I'm glad to stay as a graduate. I'm sure some people will get to it online. Thank you for your patience.
I think we have time for 2 questions. The reception will follow this up in the order of time. So if you have questions, just
Hi. I think I agree with you about Gaza, maybe not for the same reason. But one thing for sure is that Israel now has the experience of conducting a resettlement. I don't know that I agree with you on the need to resettle our settlements. If there is a two-state solution,
left in any of the Arab countries in the Middle East. And I think that the difficulty is as follows. It's just not practical. Why? Well, Palestinians will say, it would be okay within a Palestinian state to have some Jews who are subject to Palestinian authority. But we don't want to please national religious settlements. By the way, the national religious settlements are the ones in the dangerous areas, most dangerous. Second, this is why I think it's honest. Israel has this ideological commitment to protecting Jews wherever they are. The first time there's any kind of attack on the Jewish community in the new Palestinian state, the political pressures within Israel to take action, do something that I think is monumental. And I think one's just asking for it. That's why I guess I think back to at least 100,000 settlers are going to have to be moved. Yes.
Not massive.
Yes.
Has that really changed the dimension of things? Made them even more intractable. So it seems like an unprecedented situation where spoilers who are outside of the territory.
Exactly. They're not Palestinians. And by the way, they have no ambitions to get Israeli territory. They're fighting for the farm that used to belong to Syria.
So possessing the land is not enough. Having an agreement between the two sides, whatever happens, is not enough.
Well, I think the thing that I think even more relevant too short. And what's happening in Gaza, too. When I went in February, and I spent time, settlements, I spent time interviewing Palestinian refugees, I was guardedly optimistic. Olmert won an election where he was running on a platform of further unilateral disengagement. And what Olmert ran on and was elected as coalition was the settlements on the far side of the fence. And I don't believe the fence is involved. But it's a start. All these settlements on the far side of the fence were going to be evacuated. Unilaterally, if there was no partner to make it. After what happened in Gaza and Lebanon, Israel has lost all taste for unilateral initiatives where they give up land. Where, from the land they give up, there potentially could be shot. So that is, I think, very sad consequence. The other thing is, I think, not immediately promising at all, is although I think Abu Mazen is a moderate, and Israel's always saying, well, we want to have a partner on the other side with whom we can negotiate. And, Abu Mazen is a moderate. And when the Israelis talk about having a partner on the other side, is what they're thinking of, is we want a moderate Palestinian, but a moderate Palestinian who has internal control. I almost think that's an oxymoron. Right? I mean, I think this guy Barghouti, who's sitting in an Israeli jail, from my interview with students, and he's the guy who's serving 6 life sentences because he was really involved in killings. He's kind of a popular hero, and yet there's signs that he might have the capacity to make the deal. I mean, in a way, you see, I sort of think it's a Nixon goes to China kind of problem. Someone from the Labor Party can't make the deal very easily. And I don't think a Palestinian moderate can make it and sell it internally on the other hand. I mean, I think what you need is something more like a de Klerk and a Mandela. People who sort of have a share of internal capability.
I don't want to get in the way of your complete pessimism, but
don't. I prefer being optimistic.
No, there is this counterfactual look about what just happened in the war, that where you said it was a complete disaster, and the scenario in that is that in terms of narratives, each side spin the invincible Israelis and the Palestinians looking for the first victory, or the Arabs looking for the first victory. That was achieved. Now that that's achieved, and everybody's got some credibility to negotiate on each side.
Right. Who's going to negotiate?
Well, I'm not talking about who, but the possibility of negotiating, the possibility of saying we won and now we can negotiate is a really common theme in hundreds of years of European history.
No, you're quite right. After the '73 war, it was the same argument. No, I understand.
So is that a glimmer of possibility for optimism in your view, or there's none?
Not much. I mean, I mean, no, it's sometimes true, but I think if you look at the stakeholders here and who'd have to negotiate, the argument doesn't, in my view, doesn't work. I'm not a Middle Eastern expert. Yes.
What's the population trends of the two groups and the two leagues, and what will that do to the same issue in the future?
Well, in fact, I mean, the reason I suspect Sharon wanted to evacuate Gaza, and many of them could join this new party, is the demographic reality. I think there are many more Israelis who, if they could, would love to annex. But they realize that we can't be a democratic Jewish state in annex. Because immediately it would be 50-50. And soon, the Arab population is substantially higher. The birth rate among Arabs and Palestinians is much higher. Although, by the way, among the national religious settlers in the Haredim, although they're a minority, their birth rate is pretty high too. Now, among the Flemish and the Walloons, the birth rate is very, very low. Lots of immigrants in Belgium, because the population growth of native-born Belgians is a population problem. They're not going to have enough workers.
Will that make it easier or harder?
Well, I think it makes, my own view is, a one-state solution, some kind of confederal state, cannot exist with the Israelis and Palestinians unless there was some catastrophic war where there were big population shifts. There's a negotiated possibility, no possibility of a one-state solution. Okay? The problem is, and this is what has me very deeply concerned, I'm not very optimistic about a two-state solution. Why? Well, at the deepest level, for a two-state solution to work over time, I think the Palestinians have to develop the capacity to control violence, cross-border violence. And I think that for Palestine to economically develop, they very much need the economic engine of the Israeli economy. What that suggests, of course, is that a deal where there was porous borders, where it was pretty easy for workers to go across, would be a good thing. But on the other hand, it's inconceivable to me right now, and things would have to change very radically, for Israel to be willing to accept porous borders. They're going in the opposite direction. They want a real border. Why? Because, being an Israeli who doesn't know someone who hasn't been killed because of terrorist activities. So the thing that makes me most pessimistic, not only these internal conflicts, but I worry about, can there be a success? Maybe with enough international aid, it could happen. And moreover, the settlements keep expanding, having a contiguous West Bank.
Although I'm sure that we don't want to cut it off now, we really should. I really want to thank Professor Mnookin for sharing with us his insights from this comparative analysis of the Belgian and English conflicts. I really think that it demonstrates the importance of understanding the theory and practice of negotiation. I hope that it's motivated. I mean, you may not be as great as Professor Mnookin, but you can certainly gain some skills and understanding that you can apply in your own work. And I want to present Professor Mnookin with this crystal award, which says, with appreciation, Robert H. Mnookin, Sister Distinguished Scholar in Residence, Lecturer, Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution, October 11, 2006, as well as a tote bag with goodies, and I'm going to mention the goodies, in appreciation for his presentation, magnificent presentation, as a Sister Distinguished Scholar in Residence. Thank you.